The dog starts barking at the groom at the altar, and when the bride decides to investigate why, she makes a shocking discovery that leaves her horrified. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Isabella's wedding dress hung in front of the mirror, glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. The young woman gazed at her reflection, trying to convince herself that everything was going perfectly. Her wedding to James, the man who had brought stability to her life, was only a few hours away. But one detail unsettled her. Max, her loyal German shepherd, wouldn't stop barking. It wasn't his usual warning bark, nor the friendly tone he used with those few who managed to earn his trust. This bark was low, continuous, as if he was trying to say something important. "Max, what's wrong? Please, calm down. Today is an important day," Isabella said as she stroked his head. However, the dog kept staring at the front door, tense in a way Isabella couldn't decipher. James arrived minutes later, parking his luxury car in front of the house. Dressed impeccably, with that charming smile that seemed to open any door, he entered holding a bouquet of flowers. But the atmosphere changed the moment Max saw him. The German shepherd positioned himself in front of Isabella, blocking James's path with a rigid stance. His growls were barely audible, but the tension in his muscles was unmistakable. "Max, for heaven's sake, what are you doing?" "It's James," Isabella said, trying to gently push the dog aside. James smiled, though his discomfort was evident. "Don't worry, Isabella. He's probably just nervous with all the activity. It's a big day for everyone," he said with a forced laugh, reaching out toward Max. The dog didn't budge. His growling grew louder, his eyes fixed on James, as if analyzing his every move. "Max, that's enough. This isn't normal," Isabella said, taking James's hand and leading him into the house. "Sorry about this. He's never acted like this with you before." "It's okay. Don't worry. He probably just needs time to calm down. Dogs sense these things," James replied, trying to downplay the situation. But his glance at Max revealed something more. A mix of nervousness and irritation he couldn't quite hide. Inside the house, as Isabella went over the final wedding details, Max stayed by her side, watching James's every move from a distance. Every time James got closer, the dog let out a low, continuous growl, enough for Isabella to notice. "It's just a dog, Isabella. Don't you think you're overreacting?" James said, taking a sip of water from the table. Isabella shook her head. "Max has never reacted like this to anyone. He's always so calm with people he knows. This is strange." Their conversation was interrupted when Max ran to the window and began barking fiercely. Isabella quickly stood up, looking outside, but saw nothing. Still, Max's insistent behavior sent a chill down her spine. Later, as James said his goodbyes to return home and prepare for the big day, Max once again positioned himself between them. His growling grew louder, and this time, he didn't even respond to Isabella's comforting touch. "Max, please, don't make this harder," she said as she hugged the dog. James gave her one last smile. "You should rest, Isabella. Tomorrow will be unforgettable. Don't let Max make you paranoid," he said before getting into his car. Isabella closed the door, but when she turned around, Max was still barking at the entrance as if something invisible was there. That night, as she tried to sleep, Max's barking echoed in her mind. She couldn't help but remember the day she adopted him from the shelter over a decade ago. The caretaker had told her something she'd never forgotten. "This dog is special. He has an instinct that goes beyond the normal. He'll always know how to protect you, even from things you can't see." The next morning, while organizing some papers on the dining table, Max nudged a box James had left behind with his nose. When Isabella opened it, she found a photograph. In it, James stood next to an unfamiliar man in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. "What is this doing here?" she murmured, examining the image. But before she could process what she was seeing, Max began barking louder than ever. Max wouldn't stop moving. He paced through the house with firm steps, pausing occasionally to watch Isabella with eyes full of an inexplicable alertness. It was as if he was trying to speak to her, but he could only do so through gestures and looks that carried more weight than Isabella was willing to admit. The photograph she had found in James's box remained on the dining table, untouched, as if waiting to be examined more closely. Since James had entered her life, Isabella had found a stability she thought impossible after the years of mourning her mother's death. Yet, that stability now seemed to be wavering, and it appeared Max had sensed it long before she had. That morning, while trying to distract herself by organizing wedding invitations, Max's barking broke her concentration. This wasn't casual barking. It was deep, urgent, as if he were trying to warn her about something. "Max again? What's wrong with you?" Isabella muttered, placing the invitations back on the table and walking toward the dog, who was barking frantically at the dining room window. She looked outside but saw nothing unusual, just the empty street and the distant hum of cars. Still, Max wouldn't calm down. He moved back and forth, softly tapping the window with his paw and turning back to her as if urging her to pay attention. "What are you trying to tell me?" "There's nothing out there," she said, though her voice betrayed her growing unease. Tired of the constant interruptions, Isabella decided she needed to leave the house to clear her mind. However, as she gathered her things, Max began nudging a box James had left in the living room the last time he was there. Isabella frowned and knelt down to pick it up. "What's in here, Max? Why are you so insistent?" She opened the box, expecting to find something insignificant, but inside was a sealed envelope bearing a logo she didn't recognize. Beside the envelope was a small, worn leather notebook. Her heart started to race. She wasn't one to snoop through other people's belongings, but something about Max's insistence and her own intuition pushed her to open the envelope. Inside, she found an invoice for a recent transaction involving an enormous sum of money. The address listed on the document was unfamiliar, but one name in the corner caught her eye: Jacob Murphy. She had never heard that name before, but the mere fact that it was associated with James filled her with a sense of unease she couldn't ignore. "Who is Jacob Murphy?" she murmured, as Max watched her from the doorway, his posture rigid as if waiting for her reaction. She decided she needed help. With the invoice and the notebook in hand, she left the house, Max close behind. Her destination was the cafe where she always met Michelle, her best friend and confidant. When she arrived, Max settled under the table as Isabella explained everything to Michelle, from Max's unusual behavior to the photograph and the documents she had discovered. "Isabella, this is all so strange," Michelle said after listening intently. "Max has always had that protective instinct. Remember when you started dating Lucas, that guy from work, and Max couldn't stand to be near him? In the end, you found out he was cheating on you with another coworker. Max knew from the start." Isabella nodded slowly, recalling that episode vividly. Max had always had a knack for sensing danger, even when she couldn't see it herself. "And what about James?" Michelle continued. "Has he ever mentioned Jacob Murphy, or why he has such a strange voice?" "Not once," Isabella replied, nervously fiddling with the invoice in her hands. "James is always so secretive about his personal things. I thought it was just his way of being, but now I'm not so sure, Michelle. I don't like this at all." Michelle took the invoice and examined it closely. "Maybe you should talk to him directly. But honestly, if you want my opinion, I think you should investigate more before saying anything. If James is hiding something, he might get defensive if you confront him without being certain." That afternoon, Isabella returned home with more questions than answers. The photograph, the invoice, and the name Jacob Murphy swirled in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Later, while flipping through the leather notebook she had also found in the box, Max began barking again, this time at the front door. Isabella quickly stood and looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. She opened the door to find only an envelope on the ground. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Be careful with James. Not everything you see is real." Isabella felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She slammed the door shut, ensuring the lock was secure, as Max positioned himself at her side, as though he too could sense the imminent danger. "What's going on, Max?" she murmured, stroking the dog's back with trembling hands. "What am I not seeing?" That night, as she tried to sleep, the words of the shelter worker when she had adopted Max echoed in her mind. "Never ignore what he tries to tell you. Max has a special instinct. Trust him." Isabella knew she couldn't keep ignoring the signs. The next day, she would start investigating on her own, determined to uncover what James was hiding. and why Max was so adamant about protecting her from him. Before we continue with the story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Isabella woke up with the distinct feeling that her life was about to change forever. Max, as always, was lying at the foot of her bed, alert and watchful. It was as if he could sense the storm that was about to hit. That morning, as she was having breakfast, her phone rang. It was James. "Good morning, my love," he said in his usual charming yet distant tone. "I have something special planned for us this afternoon. Does that sound good?" Isabella hesitated for a moment, but didn't want to raise suspicion. "Of course, James. I'd love to," she replied neutrally, while Max watched her intently from the corner of the kitchen. After hanging up, Isabella decided she couldn't delay her search for answers any longer. She needed to know the truth before it was too late. With Max following closely behind, she went to her small desk and retrieved the invoice and the note she had received the previous night. The name Jacob Murphy was still a mystery, but she was determined to find out who he was. She powered up her computer and began her research. The first thing she uncovered was an old news article mentioning Jacob as a businessman accused of financial fraud and money laundering. Though he had been acquitted due to lack of evidence, his name was tied to multiple corruption cases. "What do you have to do with James?" Isabella murmured, biting her lip as she dug deeper. As she continued her investigation, she found something even more disturbing. An old photograph in an article showing Jacob alongside several people, including James. The picture, taken nearly a decade ago, showed a younger James, but with the same charismatic smile. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. It was clear that James had hidden this part of his life from her. But why? Before she could fully process her discovery, Max began barking furiously, pulling her out of her thoughts. "What is it now, Max?" she asked as she stood up quickly. The dog bolted to the front door, scratching at it insistently. Isabella opened it slowly, but no one was there. She looked down and saw a small package wrapped in brown paper. She picked it up cautiously and immediately closed the door. Inside the package, she found an old keychain engraved with a symbol, a snake coiled around a ring. It was the same symbol she had seen in one of the online photos linking Jacob to a network of corrupt businessmen. There was also a note inside the package that read, "Trust Max. He knows what you don't." Isabella's hands trembled as she held the note. Something deeper and far more dangerous was unfolding, and she could feel it. Max, sitting beside her, looked at her with a mix of alertness and calm, as if trying to reassure her that everything would be okay if she pressed forward. The afternoon came quickly, and James arrived as promised to pick her up. Determined to act cautiously, Isabella greeted him with a controlled smile. "Where are we going today?" she asked as James opened the car door for her. "It's a surprise, darling," James replied, avoiding her gaze. As they drove, Isabella noticed that James was taking an unusual route. Instead of heading toward their usual destinations, he drove into a more isolated area of the city. "Are we close to the place?" she asked, trying to keep her tone steady. "We're almost there," James replied with a tense smile. When they finally stopped, they were in front of an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. James got out of the car and opened the door for her. "I want to show you something important," he said, extending his hand. Isabella stepped out of the car but remained on high alert. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was cold and dark, with stacks of boxes piled everywhere. James stopped in the center of the space and turned to face her. "This place means a lot to me," he began. "It's where I started building my fortune. But it's also a place where I learned that the world can be cruel. Sometimes, you have to make hard decisions to survive." Each word he spoke only heightened Isabella's unease. "Why did you bring me here, James?" she finally asked. "I want you to trust me, Isabella. Everything I've done has been to secure our future," he replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Before she could respond, Max, who had been patiently waiting in the car, appeared at the warehouse entrance, barking furiously. His stance was clear. Something was wrong. James frowned and took a step toward the dog. "That dog is always causing trouble. You really should keep him under control," he said with an irritated tone Isabella had never heard from him before. "Max never barks without a reason," Isabella shot back, defending her loyal companion. James sighed, trying to regain his composure. "Look, Maybe we should go. This place isn't what I wanted you to see." As they drove back, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that James was hiding something significant. That night, as she reviewed the invoice and keychain again, she decided she needed professional help. She called Michelle, who suggested hiring a private investigator. "You need answers, Isabella. And if James is involved in something dangerous, you have to know before taking your next step," Michelle told her. Isabella agreed. Meanwhile, Max stayed by her side, as if understanding that the path to the truth was just beginning. Isabella stared at Max from across the dining table, her coffee growing cold in the untouched mug. Her mind was still caught up in the events of the previous night. The snake-emblazoned keychain, the cryptic note, the warehouse. It all felt like a puzzle too dark, too twisted to ignore. Max was restless, pacing back and forth near the front door, as though he was expecting something, or worse, sensing something wrong. Isabella stroked his head, searching for comfort in the loyalty of her steadfast companion. "What are you trying to tell me, Max? What do you see that I can't?" The ping of an incoming message on her phone snapped her out of her thoughts. It was from an unknown number. When she opened it, the message read, "Be careful with James. Don't trust what he says." A chill ran down her spine. Who was behind this message? And how did they know about James? She realized she couldn't put things off any longer. She called the private investigator Michelle had recommended the previous night. "I need your help urgently. I'm not sure who the person I'm about to marry really is," she explained, trying to keep her voice steady. The investigator, a man named Carlos Vega, replied in a calm yet determined tone, "I'll need everything you have on him. Photos, documents, even the smallest details you can recall. Everything could be key to understanding who he really is." "I'll send everything I have right away," Isabella said as she rummaged through the box containing James's belongings. As she organized the items to send over, Max began barking insistently, heading toward the window. Isabella rushed over and, looking outside, saw a man wearing dark glasses and a hat standing across the street. He seemed to be watching her house. When Isabella moved the curtain, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. Her heart raced. She closed the curtains and tried to calm Max. "It's okay, Max. I'm here with you. Nothing's going to happen while we're together," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Hours later, James arrived at the house with a more affectionate demeanor than usual. He carried flowers and wore a flawless smile that seemed rehearsed. "I wanted to surprise you with these, my love. I know you've been stressed with the wedding preparations," he said, placing the flowers on the table. Max, however, remained focused. He positioned himself between Isabella and James, letting out a low but constant growl. James sighed, feigning patience. "You really should train this dog better, Isabella. He's becoming a problem," he commented, attempting to pet Max, who quickly backed away, baring his teeth. Isabella crossed her arms and stared at him firmly. "Max has never been a problem. If he doesn't trust someone, he usually has a good reason for it," she said, her tone sharper than usual. James raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. I didn't mean to upset you. I guess he just needs more time to get used to me," he replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, while James slept soundly on the couch in the living room, Isabella decided to take the opportunity to dig deeper. With Max by her side, she silently crept upstairs and revisited the box James had left the previous week. She found a bank deposit receipt that caught her attention. It was under the name Jacob Murphy, the same man linked to shady dealings in the news. The receipt not only confirmed a connection between James and Jacob, but also showed a recent date, just 2 weeks ago. Isabella felt a mix of anger and fear rising within her. How could he hide something this significant? Suddenly, Max began barking intensely, as though he sensed something in the air. Isabella rushed downstairs, fearing the worst. She found James standing by the front door, phone in hand and a tense expression on his face. "What are you doing awake?" Isabella asked, trying to maintain her composure. James quickly pocketed his phone. "I heard noises and thought someone might be outside," he replied with a smile that felt forced. "What about you? Why are you awake at this hour?" Max heard something too. "Maybe you should check outside, just in case," she suggested. hoping to buy herself some time to process what she had just discovered. James nodded and stepped out to check the front yard. But when he returned and assured her there was no one there, Isabella knew she had to tread carefully. She couldn't confront him directly, not yet. She needed solid proof. The next day, Carlos, the investigator, called with an update. The name Jacob Murphy appears in multiple police reports, but he always manages to stay under the radar. However, I found something more concerning. James has several bank accounts registered in offshore tax havens. It's possible he's involved in illegal activities. Isabella felt her world crumbling around her. As she hung up the phone, Max sat beside her, resting his head on her lap. She stroked his fur as tears threatened to spill. "You always knew something wasn't right, didn't you, Max? I should never have ignored you," she murmured, her voice trembling. That night, as Isabella stared at the flowers James had brought her, she made a decision. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. She knew there was something much darker behind all of this, and she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The morning dawned heavy at Isabella's home. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, but it failed to dissipate the tension that hung thick in the air. Max remained vigilant, his eyes tracking every movement, while Isabella mentally reviewed the documents Carlos, the investigator, had sent earlier that morning. Each line confirmed her worst fears. James was not only connected to Jacob Murphy, but also to an illegal network involving money laundering and international fraud. As James left for what he called an important business meeting, Isabella decided to seize the opportunity. With Max by her side, she headed to James's room, determined to find more clues. "If you're involved in something this dark, I won't stay in the dark myself," she muttered while carefully searching through the desk drawers. After several minutes of searching, Max barked insistently at a small metal box tucked under the desk. Isabella pulled it out carefully, and upon opening it, she found a collection of photographs. One, in particular, caught her eye. It showed James at a meeting with Jacob Murphy and several other men, all dressed casually but with serious expressions. On the back of the photo, there was an inscription, "Final Agreement, April 12th. A knot tightened in Isabella's stomach. That date matched the day James had returned from a business trip just before proposing to her. Had he been planning this all along? Before she could fully process her thoughts, her phone rang. It was Carlos. "Isabella, I just discovered something we can't ignore. Jacob Murphy is under investigation for the disappearance of several people. James might be more involved than we thought." "Disappearances? What are you talking about, Carlos?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. "I don't have all the details yet, but the connections are undeniable. James is a close associate of Jacob, and there are indications that James's properties might be used to cover up these activities. You need to be extremely careful, Isabella. This is far bigger than shady business dealings." Isabella hung up the phone, her hands shaking. She looked at Max, who remained by her side like a protective shadow. "Max, what have I done? I'm engaged to a man who could be dangerous. How could I have been so blind?" she whispered, pulling him into a hug. As evening fell, James returned home with his usual carefree demeanor, as though he carried no dark secrets. "Darling, I've thought of something special for tonight. Let's have dinner at that restaurant you love. I want you to relax a little," he said with his trademark charming smile. Isabella forced herself to remain composed. "That sounds nice. I could use some fresh air," she replied, while her mind raced with plans for her next steps. The dinner began uneventfully, with James talking about work and business. But Isabella couldn't stop analyzing every gesture, every word, looking for signs that would confirm what she already knew. Finally, she decided to test him. "James, have you ever heard of Jacob Murphy?" she asked casually, swirling the wine in her glass. James hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to notice, before responding. "Murphy? No, I don't think so. Why do you ask?" His voice was calm, but his gaze avoided hers. "I just heard his name on the news. It sounded familiar. Maybe I've seen him with you at some point," Isabella said, smiling with feigned innocence. James let out a brief, nervous laugh. "Definitely not. I don't associate with people who make the news for bad reasons. My circle is different." Isabella took a sip of her wine, keeping her expression neutral, but inside, she knew he was lying. Her polite smile concealed a racing heart and a mind calculating her next move. Back home, James went straight to his study. Isabella, feigning exhaustion, went upstairs with Max, but as soon as she heard James close the door behind him, she acted. She opened her laptop and began digging deeper into Jacob Murphy and the disappearances Carlos had mentioned. She came across an article about an abandoned property on the outskirts of the city linked to Murphy. The location had been reported several times for suspicious activity but had never been thoroughly investigated. Isabella noticed something else. The address matched the one mentioned in the note she had found in James's box days earlier. Max, as if reading her thoughts, let out a soft bark and looked toward the door, as though urging her to act quickly. "I know, Max. This can't wait any longer," Isabella said, closing her laptop and preparing for what she knew would be a dangerous night. Later, when James was sound asleep, Isabella grabbed her car keys and quietly slipped out of the house, with Max sitting in the back seat. The address led her to an old warehouse on the city's outskirts, a dark and desolate place that looked straight out of a horror film. "Max, stay close. I don't like this," she said, gripping a flashlight with trembling hands. Inside the warehouse, the air was heavy with a metallic, damp smell. Isabella's footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as Max walked beside her, alert to every sound. In one corner, she found a shelf stacked with boxes labeled with names and dates. Opening one, she discovered photographs and documents that seemed to incriminate several people, including James. Then she heard a noise behind her. Max immediately positioned himself between Isabella and the shadow moving in the darkness. A man stepped forward, his face instantly recognizable, Jacob Murphy. "It seems you've wandered into a place you don't belong, miss," Jacob said, his voice cold and menacing. Isabella swallowed hard but didn't back down. "Maybe it's time someone exposed what's happening here." "I'm not staying quiet," she replied firmly. Jacob let out a dry laugh. "And what do you plan to do? Bark like your dog? This isn't a game, girl. You should go back to your cozy little house and forget all about this before it's too late." Max growled, baring his teeth, and Jacob took a step back, clearly intimidated by the dog. "You'd better keep that pet under control before it causes trouble," he said as he slowly retreated. Isabella returned home with her heart pounding. She knew she had crossed a dangerous line, but she was more determined than ever. James wasn't who he claimed to be, and his connection to Jacob Murphy ran deeper than she could have imagined. The sun shone brightly, as if unaware of the storm of uncertainty looming on the horizon. Isabella had woken up early, not out of excitement for the day, but because of the weight pressing down on her chest. Since returning from the warehouse, thoughts about James and his connection to Jacob Murphy had haunted her, leaving no room for sleep. But what kept her grounded was Max, always vigilant, as if he knew this day would mark a point of no return. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, running her hand slowly over Max's fur. "Today is the day, Max. If he doesn't give me answers, there won't be a wedding. I can't marry someone I don't trust." Max let out a soft bark, as if affirming her words. Downstairs, in the study, James was finalizing details with his team. He seemed kind, as always, but there was something in his tone that Isabella couldn't ignore, a false note she hadn't noticed before. When he came upstairs to find her, Max immediately stood guard, blocking the bedroom door. "Max again?" James said with a nervous laugh. "Honey, when is he going to accept that I'm part of your life too?" Without taking her eyes off her dog, Isabella replied, "Maybe when you stop keeping secrets, James. Max is just protecting me. He always has." James tilted his head, as though considering her words, but quickly brushed the topic aside. "Come on, let's not do this today. This is our big day. The car will be here in half an hour." Isabella rose slowly. "Sure, James. Just give me a few more minutes to get ready," she said, without fully committing. The church was impeccably decorated, with white flowers filling the air with a sweet aroma. The guests, dressed elegantly, waited eagerly for the bride's entrance. Meanwhile, Isabella, accompanied by Max, waited in a small room at the back. It was an unconventional sight, a bride in her white lace gown, sitting beside her German shepherd, her silent protector. Max, If there's something I haven't seen yet, I need you to show me. I can't take this step with doubts, she whispered, hugging him tightly. Outside, James stood at the altar, radiating confidence. But something about his posture seemed forced. Every time he glanced at the entrance, his eyes shifted, as if he were expecting something other than Isabella. As the music began to play, Isabella stood, took a deep breath, and began walking toward the altar with Max by her side. But as they advanced down the aisle, Max stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on James. What happened next unfolded in an instant. Max began barking with an intensity Isabella had never seen before, drawing everyone's attention. "Max, stop!" Isabella tried to calm him, but the dog wouldn't relent. His barks echoed like an alarm throughout the church. "What the hell is wrong with your dog?" James demanded, his tone lacking the usual calmness. Feeling the weight of all the guests' stares, Isabella made a decision. She turned to Max, who continued barking without pause, and then faced James. "Max is never wrong, James. If he's acting like this, there's something I'm not seeing." "What are you hiding?" she asked firmly. "What? Are you serious?" James replied, forcing a laugh. "This doesn't make any sense, Isabella. Your dog is just agitated. He's an animal." "Max is never wrong," Isabella repeated. Silence fell over the church. Max, as if sensing the moment had come, moved toward James, circling him slowly. His gaze locked on James's inner jacket pocket. Isabella, noticing her dog's behavior, stepped closer. "What's in your pocket, James?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Are you really doing this here?" James said, losing his composure. "There's nothing in my pocket that matters to you." "Then show me," Isabella demanded, her voice unwavering, surprising even the guests. James hesitated, but the murmurs among the guests grew louder. Finally, with a tense smile, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metallic object, a box Isabella had never seen before. "What's that, James?" she asked, as Max's barking grew louder. "It's just a gift," James said, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. Without hesitation, Isabella grabbed the box from his hands and opened it in front of everyone. Inside was a small bag of white powder. She didn't need to be an expert to recognize what it was. "What does this mean, James?" she asked, her voice breaking. James took a step back, but before he could respond, Max positioned himself in front of him, growling with a ferocity that froze everyone in place. Holding the box high, Isabella stared directly at James. "What are you doing with this? What else have you been hiding from me?" James tried to justify himself, but the damage was done. The murmurs in the church turned into an uproar, and several guests began to leave. Back home, Isabella sat on the floor beside Max, stroking his head as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you, Max. You've always been there to protect me, even when I didn't want to see the truth," she said softly. Her phone buzzed with a message from Carlos. "I've gathered more evidence against James. We were right. I'm on my way to help you with the next steps." Isabella looked at Max, who remained silent but alert, his eyes scanning for any threats. "This isn't over, Max. But thanks to you, I know I can face it." The afternoon following the disastrous wedding attempt, Isabella paced her living room, frustration and determination etched into her face. Her wedding dress still hung in the corner of her bedroom, now a symbol of what could have been and what would never be. Max followed closely at her heels, faithful as ever, yet exuding a heightened sense of vigilance that hadn't left him since the day before. "Max, this isn't over. James won't back down easily, but neither will I," Isabella said as she picked up her phone and dialed Carlos, her former friend and now unlikely ally in this storm. "Carlos, I need everything you've got. The evidence, the names, everything," she demanded firmly. "I'm already on my way, Isabella," Carlos replied on the other end. "I'm bringing everything you need to expose him. This won't be easy, but we need to do it right." Isabella hung up and let out a deep breath. While the public confrontation was over, she could feel the worst was yet to come. James wasn't just unmasked. He'd been humiliated in front of his most important circles. She knew that made him dangerous. Hours later, Carlos arrived at Isabella's home with a briefcase full of documents. Max, as usual, inspected the visitor thoroughly before relaxing his guard. "Still doesn't trust his own shadow, huh?" Carlos said, scratching the German shepherd's head. "Can't blame him," Isabella replied. "If it weren't for Max, who knows where I'd be right now." Carlos set the briefcase on the table and began laying out the papers. There were records of suspicious transactions, photographs of James with individuals linked to illegal activities, and contracts that made it clear the man Isabella had planned to marry wasn't who he claimed to be. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Carlos explained, pointing to the pages. "James isn't just a millionaire with questionable business deals. He's tied to a much larger network. That powder you found at the church isn't isolated. It's part of something far darker." Isabella stared at the documents with a mix of horror and determination. Each page was proof of James's double life, a life she had nearly walked into without question. "What do we do with this?" she asked, looking directly at Carlos. "We have two options," he replied. "We can take this straight to the authorities or use it as leverage to ensure he can't get near you again. But both options come with risks." Max, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, barked once and positioned himself beside Isabella. She stroked his head, drawing comfort from his loyalty. "I can't stay silent, Carlos. Not after all this. James has used his money to hide the truth, but not anymore." Meanwhile, in a luxurious apartment in the heart of the city, James sat before a large window, staring out at the skyline with a simmering fury. The scene at the church played over and over in his mind. The moment all his carefully constructed lies began to crumble. His phone vibrated, and when he answered, a cold voice on the other end said, "You need to handle this. If she talks, we're finished." James gripped the phone tightly. "Don't worry. Isabella won't get that far. I'll take care of it personally." He ended the call and glanced at a photo of Isabella on his desk. "It didn't have to end like this, Isabella," he murmured. But deep down, he knew his obsession with control had sealed his fate. Back at Isabella's house, as she and Carlos strategized their next moves, Max began barking furiously at the front door. Both of them froze, tension rising in the room. "Are you expecting anyone else?" Carlos asked. Isabella shook her head and stood slowly. Peering out the window, she saw a black car parked across the street, its headlights off. A figure moved inside, but she couldn't make out who it was. "Carlos, stay here. I'm going to check it out," she said, grabbing a flashlight. "You're not going alone," he replied, rising to his feet. Max led the way, ears erect and growling softly. When Isabella opened the door, the car sped off abruptly, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. But before disappearing, someone tossed an envelope out the window. Isabella picked it up with trembling hands and tore it open. Inside was a handwritten note. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Carlos took the note and examined it closely. "This means we're closer than we thought, but it also means it's getting more dangerous." "There's no turning back now," Isabella said, her eyes blazing with resolve. "If they think I'll stop, they don't know what I'm capable of." That night, as Isabella pored over the documents with Carlos, Max stationed himself by the door, alert to every sound. Despite the tension, there was a strange calm in the house, as if they all understood the battle wasn't over but were ready to face it together. "Carlos," Isabella said after a long silence, "I want this to end, not just for me, but for Max. He saved me from making the worst mistake of my life, and I won't let his bravery go to waste." "We'll end this, Isabella," Carlos assured her with a small smile. "And when it's over, you and Max can start fresh. No fears, no shadows." The next morning dawned heavy with tension and determination. Isabella, after a sleepless night, knew the time for doubt had passed. The documents Carlos had provided were a solid case against James, but they were also a glimpse into a dark world she had never imagined herself part of. Max, loyal and ever alert, stayed close by her side, as if he too understood the gravity of the day ahead. "Max, this isn't just for us," she said, stroking his head. "This is for all the people he's used and destroyed. I won't let him keep getting away with it." The doorbell suddenly rang, breaking the silence of the house. Isabella and Carlos exchanged a tense glance. When she opened the door, they were greeted by a woman dressed elegantly, her expression serious. Miss Isabella Martinez, the woman said in a formal tone. I'm Charlotte Ramos, an attorney specializing in financial crimes. Carlos contacted me. I'm here to help. Relief washed over Isabella at the thought of not facing James alone. Thank you for coming, Charlotte. There's a lot you need to know, but I warn you, this won't be easy, Isabella said, inviting her inside. I know, Isabella, but if there's one thing I've learned in my years of practice, it's that the truth always finds its way. We're going to handle this the right way, Charlotte replied with a confidence that bolstered Isabella's resolve. Over the next few hours, Isabella, Carlos, and Charlotte meticulously combed through the documents, building a strong case against James. As they worked, memories of all the times Isabella had blindly trusted James crept into her thoughts, from romantic dinners to his promises of a happy, stable future. Every moment now felt tainted by deception. Do you think he's always been like this? Isabella asked Carlos as they reviewed incriminating photographs. I don't know, Isabella, Carlos replied, flipping through the images, but I do know people like him always show their true colors eventually. It's just a matter of time. Charlotte interrupted, pointing to one of the most critical documents. This contract is key. It proves James was involved in a money laundering scheme using shell companies. If we present this alongside the other evidence, he won't have a way out. Isabella nodded. I don't just want him to pay for what he did to me. I want everyone to know who he really is. And if that means confronting him publicly, I'll do it. Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, James received the news that Isabella had hired a lawyer. His connections kept him informed, but the idea of his secrets being revealed filled him with fury. He slammed his fist on the table, sending a glass of whiskey shattering to the floor. I won't let this ruin my reputation, he muttered, dialing one of his closest associates. You need to handle this, he demanded coldly. I don't care what it takes. She can't keep going. That night, as Isabella tried to rest, a text message buzzed on her phone. The sender was unknown, but the content was clear. You're playing with fire. If you keep going, the consequences will be irreversible. Her heart raced as she read the message, but she refused to let fear take hold. I won't stop, Max. No matter what they try, she said to the dog, who seemed to understand her resolve and stayed close to her side. The next morning, Isabella called a meeting with Charlotte and Carlos to finalize their strategy. They decided the first step was to present the evidence to authorities and ensure the media was informed. Public impact will be key, Charlotte explained. We can't give him the chance to control the narrative. If we confront him directly and decisively, his ability to maneuver will be minimal. Isabella agreed, confident in their plan. But before they could proceed, something unexpected happened. During their meeting, Max began barking frantically and ran toward the back door of the house. Isabella quickly followed, sensing something was wrong. When she opened the door, she found a note pinned to the garden fence. The message read, "This is your last warning. Stop now, or you'll pay the price." Carlos approached her, examining the note with a grave expression. This isn't just a threat, Isabella. It's a real warning. They're willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Though shaken, Isabella refused to back down. I'm not stopping, Carlos. If they think this will make me retreat, they don't know me. That night, as they finished their preparations, Isabella sat with Max, finding solace in their bond. Max, I don't know what I would have done without you, she said, stroking his head. You saved me from a future built on lies. And now, thanks to you, I can see things clearly. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but whatever happens, I know I'm not alone. Max wagged his tail and let out a soft bark, as if reassuring her that everything would be fine. The next day marked the beginning of the final confrontation. Isabella, accompanied by Charlotte and Carlos, presented the evidence to authorities and organized a press conference to expose the truth. James's mansion, once a symbol of luxury and power, now stood as a testament to deceit and corruption. As cameras focused on her, Isabella spoke with a determination that surprised even the most seasoned journalists. For too long, I was deceived by someone I trusted completely. But today, I'm here to ensure the truth comes to light, no matter the consequences. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. Isabella stood by her window, watching the sunrise that marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of chaos and redemption. James was now facing the legal consequences of his actions, with the evidence presented by Charlotte and Carlos ensuring justice would prevail. The truth had triumphed, but not without an emotional cost. Max, her loyal companion, lay by her feet, ever watchful. To Isabella, he wasn't just a dog. He was her protector, her family, and the symbol of unwavering loyalty that had anchored her through her darkest moments. You know something, Max? Despite everything, I'm grateful, not just for having you by my side, but for learning that we should never ignore our intuition or the ones who truly love us, she said, stroking his fur. Max lifted his head, looking at her with those wise, knowing eyes. Isabella smiled. She knew she had made the right choice by choosing truth and freedom over a life built on lies. Weeks later, Isabella decided to organize an event in the city's main park, a celebration of the unique bond between humans and animals. The idea had come to her while reflecting on everything Max had done for her. She wanted others to understand the importance of those loyal companions who often see what we cannot. The park was bustling with families, children, and their pets, all enjoying the joyful and supportive atmosphere. Isabella, with Max by her side, took the microphone to share her story. Today, I want to thank you all for being here and allowing me to share something personal, she began. For a long time, I thought my life was under control, that everything was as it should be. But I learned that appearances can be deceiving and that sometimes the people we trust the most can betray us. However, I also learned that there will always be someone willing to protect us, even when we can't see the danger. For me, that someone was Max, she said, gesturing to the German shepherd standing proudly by her side. The crowd erupted in applause, and several people approached her to thank her for her words. A small boy timidly walked up and asked, "Do you think my dog can protect me like Max protected you?" Isabella knelt down to meet the boy's eyes and smiled. "Of course he can. They're always there for us, even when we don't always understand what they're trying to tell us. You just need to listen to him and trust him." The event was a resounding success, inspiring many to value their pets more and creating a network of support for rescued animals. For Isabella, it was a turning point. She found a renewed sense of purpose and decided to collaborate with local organizations to help other dogs like Max, ensuring they had the chance to find a loving home. In the days that followed, Isabella's life began to stabilize. She opened a small adoption and rescue center, a place where people could connect with animals in need of care and affection. Although the journey hadn't been easy, she felt at peace, knowing she had turned her pain into something positive. Max became a beloved figure in the community. Children adored him, and adults admired his bravery and loyalty. He was the perfect example of how a seemingly simple being could profoundly change a life. One quiet afternoon, as Isabella organized papers in her office, Carlos stopped by, looking relaxed and smiling. "How's everything going here?" he asked, glancing around at the bustling center. "Better than I ever expected," Isabella replied, handing him a cup of tea. "I never thought this place could mean so much to me and to others." Carlos looked at her with pride. "You've done something incredible, Isabella. You turned a painful experience into something that can change lives. Not everyone has that strength." Isabella sighed, stroking Max, who was, as always, by her side. "The strength wasn't just mine. Max taught me how to move forward, how to trust my instincts. Without him, I wouldn't have made it this far." That evening, as she closed the center, Isabella and Max sat in the nearby park, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It was a moment of calm, a breather after so many battles. "Max, we did it," she said softly. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that as long as you're by my side, everything will be okay." The German shepherd responded with a gentle bark, as if affirming her words. Isabella smiled, gazing at the horizon with hope. She knew she had found a new purpose, guided by the loyalty and unconditional love of her faithful companion. Isabella and Max's journey teaches us that true loyalty and love don't always come from the people we expect, but from those who show unwavering support in our darkest times. It also reminds us that trusting our instincts and the beings who care for us can save us from wrong decisions and open doors to a better future. Ultimately, the courage to face the truth and the ability to turn pain into purpose lead us to a life filled with meaning and hope. Thank you for listening to this incredible story until the end. If you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We also suggest watching the video that appears on the screen so you can discover other amazing stories, because I guarantee you'll be surprised.